Thank you, Alan, and thank you everyone for coming along. We could have done maybe a slightly bigger room, but we got everyone in pretty much, I think. Well, 2 years and nearly 4 months ago, 17.4 million of us voted to leave the European Union. And I think when we did, we would have hoped by now to be rather further on in that process. I'm actually excited tonight because normally, you know, I have another UKIP speaker, you know, to tub thump, and we'll be doing a bit of that. But tonight we have a special guest speaker. And I must say, over the last couple of years, there are various Conservatives who I've slightly fallen out with because I think they've fallen short in delivering Brexit. But Stuart Jackson is one of the notable exceptions to that, because Stuart, all the way back, I think it was November 2011, Stuart resigned his job as a parliamentary private secretary to vote against David Cameron's command and in favour of an in-out referendum. I think, I'm trying to remember whether 81 Conservatives did that, but there was a handful who were sort of on the rung of the government ladder and gave up that so they could vote for an in-out referendum. And you know, every day since then, and quite a few days before then even as well, Stuart has been robust for a full, clean Brexit. You may well know as well that Stuart was special advisor to David Davis and negotiating Brexit to their very best advantage and ability, only to have a growing suspicion that there was a bit of a shadow team going on and a shadow plan. And Stuart left his post when David Davis left his, but now campaigns pretty strongly to get rid of Chequers and get Brexit back on track. So I'm looking forward to Stuart speaking to you soon and hearing a bit of perhaps some sort of inside assessment from someone who speaks to the key players of just how we're doing, how much is salvageable, and you know, any suggestions that we in this room can do to help the process along. Just from my own point of view, I think it's important to say that Essex, I believe I'm saying every district in Essex voted to leave the European Union. So, you know, let's get on and do that. I think, again, I'm right in saying every MP in Essex is a Conservative, and most of them pay at least lip service to the Brexit process. Some of them more than that, and I'd sort of single out for praise John Whittingdale. James Duddridge, I think, was putting his head above a parapet on that fact last week. Priti Patel up the road, fantastic. You know, I first met her at the inaugural Referendum Party conference. I'm thinking back when that would have been, about 1996, something like that, or maybe even before. And she's clearly passionate about achieving the departure from the European Union that everybody wants to see. Then you've got a sort of a group I may refer to as trimmers. I wasn't very keen on hearing what James Cleverly said about Brexit at the Conservative conference. I don't know if he was joking or not, but down a notch in my estimation. And I think, for instance, Rebecca Harris in Castle Point was allegedly a strong Brexiteer, but I haven't seen her even deliver a peep of criticism against Brexit. She's a whip. I nearly misheard you there. I'm in that, but she's a whip, so she's constrained. But that's fair enough. So whenever I sort of think about how Brexit's going, I go back to something that UKIP put out in actually only March 2017. It seems longer ago, and we called it 6 Key Tests to Prove Brexit Means Exit, and it's a useful little checklist to go through. And we began with a legal test saying that Parliament must resume its supremacy of lawmaking with no impediments, and we must completely remove ourselves from the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Well, that doesn't seem to be happening under the Chequers direction. If you were the most eminent expert in terms of the legal side of Brexit is a man called Martin Howe QC, who wrote a devastating blog when the Chequers plan was first unveiled, to make clear that really the European Court of Justice will retain jurisdiction There are one or two ways in which the government can claim, in the letter that it formally hasn't got it, but in spirit it has, and particularly with this idea that we need a common rule book, i.e. the EU's rule book, to determine our things like our product standards and, and trading arrangements, that's the European Court of Justice is the supreme jurisdiction of that kind of stuff in the EU, and it will still, I think that there is a phrase about Britain taking note of its rulings. It's clearly under the Chequers plan will be left in complete control of the regulations that already exist in terms of goods. So there's a big fail on that, and I should say as I go through these 6 points, which is the key thing I'm going to do, is so much of it is under the counter with Theresa May, under the table, invisible. We listen, she says one thing, and as David Davis and Stuart found out, something else is going on behind the scenes, so it's difficult to judge. So we come to our second test, which is the migration test, where we said Britain must resume full control of its immigration and asylum policies and border controls without impediments, qualifications or restrictions, and we must not be bound by any freedom of movement obligation. And finally, departure terms must facilitate the government finally making good on its broken promise to cut annual net migration to the tens of thousands. Well, we still don't really know where we're going on immigration policy in terms of Brexit. The Prime Minister still pays lip service to ending free movement. What may happen is if there's a withdrawal agreement, not much will be said about the detail of immigration, and that will be left to be hammered out during the so-called transition period and a sort of future framework agreement, leaving grounds for more surrenders and climb downs. It may well be, if we do leave with an agreement, that in technical terms our obligation to free movement is over, but then the government signs up to something very similar to free movement as part of the future relationship. So it's very difficult to know where we are. It's very difficult to trust what the Prime Minister says, is all I can say on that. But fears are rising that there won't be, the kind of very large cuts to immigration that will allow that tens of thousand target to finally be met after 8 years. And then the third test we had was something called the maritime test, because we thought particularly our fishing industry and our coastal communities in general needed a political party to stick up for them. They're an industry that easily gets overlooked, and was certainly overlooked when we joined the EEC in the early 1970s. And again, we said joining the EEC involved a betrayal of our coastal communities. They must not be betrayed again. Leaving the EU must involve restoring to the UK full maritime sovereignty, complete control of our exclusive economic zone, which stretches 200 miles off the coast or to the halfway point between the UK and neighbouring countries. Again, we've had some sort of warm talk from Michael Gove and his ministers in DEFRA, but equally it seems likely, and ministers have said as much, that there'll be some continuation of access to our waters for European fishing fleets, and that will perhaps be used as a bartering chip in the negotiations. What we haven't had from ministers lately is any guarantee that our waters will be exclusively for our fishing fleet, with the only qualification to that while they're rebuilding their strength and their capacity, perhaps there's a case for some short-term licenses to fish. But it seems like a long-term arrangement is headed, which will effectively allow the European fleets to keep plundering our waters. So again, it's hard to know exactly where we are, but it doesn't look good. Until recently, I was more optimistic about the fourth test, which was the trade test. We said the UK must retake its seat on the World Trade Organization. Now, under any arrangement, it looks like that is going to happen, and resume its sovereign right to sign trade agreements with other countries. Well, I suspect that will technically still be allowed, but it looks like vast swathes of the stuff you would put in trade agreements will be off limits, because we may well be signed up to European rules and regulations for the foreseeable future, which will make free trade agreements more difficult and less attractive to some of the big economies in the world with which we don't have them. And when President Trump came in the summer, he pretty well said that if she goes with a checkers type approach, that'll make it very difficult for the US to sign an agreement with us, and that would be a huge advantage if they did. So I think in name only the trade test is being fulfilled, but what's the point really of having a Department for International Trade if their hands are tied about the scale of agreements they can enter into? The fifth test, penultimate test, was the money test, where we optimistically said there must be no final settlement payment to the EU and no ongoing payments to the EU budget. And we also asked for our money back from things like the European Investment Bank. Well, now I could have lived with a bit of a fail on this if the carrot of money had been effectively used as leverage on the other areas. But I think we signed up to the things the EU wanted early, and the £39 billion settlement, without really nailing them down on what we wanted. And obviously, one key point there was this so-called Irish backstop, where Theresa May seems to have given an undertaking, not only that the UK wouldn't impose a hard border in Ireland, but also that the UK is not allowed to do anything that, and Stuart will correct me if I get the detail wrong here, but the UK is not allowed to do anything that makes the EU or the government of the Republic of Ireland think that they need to put in a hard border, and that was a crazy undertaking. Some people suspect deliberately from some of the senior civil servants, which leads us down a path of having no leverage and pretty much being trapped perhaps permanently in this so-called backstop arrangement with at least Northern Ireland in the customs union of the EU, and potentially maybe the rest of us as well, with no end date. But anyway, so the money test, the money certainly is on the table, and we haven't really got anything for it as far as I can see. And the final thing that we said was the time test. And this was written before Theresa May had the brilliant idea of a general election in 2017 with a manifesto that included things like the dementia tax. But anyway, we said at the time, it was David Cameron still Prime Minister. No, it wasn't David Cameron still Prime Minister, was it? But we referred to David Cameron holding the referendum early in the government's term, therefore it being reasonable to expect Brexit to be completed well before the next general election, which was due in 2020. So we said then, to go into the 2020 election with loose ends left untied, or an open-ended transition still in progress, would risk plunging the country into a new era of uncertainty and emboldening those who wish to overturn the referendum result. And that certainly seems to have happened. The dither and the delay has certainly led the defeated side to come up with all sorts of ruses why Brexit can't happen, to feeding its friends in the media. I know we have a BBC reporter here today, but I will exempt the BBC local reporting from my criticism here. But I think their national reporting, has been overwhelmingly anti-Brexit, scaremongering. And not only the BBC, in my view, in recent months, Sky is probably even worse than the BBC. And ITV not far behind, and that's without even mentioning our old foes at Channel 4 News and Newsnight, who you can always rely on to be hysterical against Brexit. So the delay has fed the doubt, and it's really quite a tribute, I think, to everyone who voted Brexit, that they haven't been in any significant numbers scared off it. The other side, the establishment, I think, was hoping for a wholesale collapse to be picked up in the opinion polls to say Britain's gone off Brexit. They haven't had that. They've had the most marginal, if any, shift in their direction, and this has been at a time when the rules of impartiality in the media haven't been observed. You've seen the Daily Express newspaper my old paper being taken over by the Mirror Group. You've seen the Daily Mail have a new call him tactfully a pro-soft Brexit editor. So two of the main newspaper stalwarts for Brexit have had their teeth drawn too, and yet the public show no sign of mass retreat on this. And I think that's been the absolute key thing to keep us on the road, really, because I've been stunned at just how far so many people in the establishment have been prepared to go to override this basic act of democracy, and the idea of the ultra-remainers that they could overturn the referendum result and everyone would just shrug and think that's fine and go back to pre-referendum and stay in the EU is for the birds. It would be the most enormously destabilising thing, and it may be true that for a few big businesses who like their seamless supply chains, that leaving the EU is a bit bumpy while new arrangements are worked out. But you know, they had their argument during the referendum, and people understood, I think, that you know, if you were simply going to judge Brexit on whether it was economically disruptive or not, you probably wouldn't have voted for it. But there were so many other things that Brexit could bring, including immigration control and settled communities, including the most basic thing of bringing back our democratic sovereignty. And I think people decided that economically, whether it was easy or not, it was certainly reached a point where it was doable. And so to hear now that the big media constantly